All four of the main parties have ideas to get the province moving. Our next guests spend a lot of time considering those ideas. So joining us now with their advice in Waterloo, Ontario, Jeff Costello. He's Professor of Transportation at the University of Waterloo. And with us here in studio, Cherise Burda, Ontario Director at the Pembina Institute, and Tess Kalinowski. She is Transportation Reporter at the Toronto Star. A reminder that our producers, Eric Bombacino and Elamine Abdelmahmoud, are hosting a live chat right now. So come on in, join the conversation. It's on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or you can reach us via Twitter and use the hashtag AgendaTVO. Welcome back to you. Welcome for the first time to you, Tess. And Jeff, good to have you on the line again from Waterloo. Let me read this little nugget of something here just to set up the discussion and get us started. Quote, average round-trip commute time of 82 minutes, which is the longest daily commute of all U.S. and Canadian cities, costs our economy $6 billion annually in lost productivity, predicted to rise to $15 billion annually by the year 2031. Population growth of 2.5 million in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area expected in the next 20 years. All of that from the Transit Investment Strategy Advisory Panel came out last fall. That's what we're trying to deal with. Jeff, to you first, how would you characterize the transportation infrastructure we have today in the GTHA?
I think the right answer, Steve, is insufficient, and it hasn't grown sufficiently since it was put into place. If you think about what the last major investment in the transportation network was in the GTHA was probably the Yonge Line. You've had a couple of minor subway additions that have been built, but basically what is there is incredibly utilized. The 401, the Gardiner Expressway, the subway, the Bloor-Danforth lines, these are all really well used, but the city has grown and the transportation network hasn't really grown up with it.
Cherise, is it too strong to say we've experienced decades of neglect in this region of the province?
Yeah, I would agree. I think in the last 2 decades, the only new subways that have been open and are in operation are 8 kilometers. That's just not keeping up with our population growth for sure. And I think part of the problem with that is that we're too obsessed with subways, and our subway myopia is getting in the way of the vision of regionalness, because we can't build subways everywhere. They're too expensive, so we end up being bogged down in political battles over who gets a subway, and we build little fragments of subway. They're not connected to a whole system. And we're just not moving fast enough, and we need to start looking at other jurisdictions who aren't obsessed with technology and instead are looking at important factors like how do we reach the most people, reach the most neighborhoods, serve riders with reliable and frequent transit, and how do we get that infrastructure in place fast.
More on those options as we go along in our discussion here. Tess, as you've watched this file, it's not like nothing's been done. So getting better or getting worse as you've watched it?
I almost feel like it's static. I've been doing the transportation reporting for the Star for about 7 years, and in that time, I have covered a lot of transit. I have never covered the opening of a new line. And to me, that's very telling. I've covered a lot of debates, however, at City Hall and the provincial legislature on the streets. So I think we're kind of stuck.
Stuck is the way you'd put it.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeff, Metrolinx, which is this organization designed to take a regional look at things, has estimated that they're going to need, or we're going to need, I guess, $2 billion a year to implement this grand transportation/transit vision they call the Big Move. Let's start with this. $2 billion a year. Does that sound like the right number to you?
It seems reasonable to me. I mean, it depends on how many years, of course, but if we're talking about a 15 or a 20-year plan, then yeah, $2 billion a year, $30 or $40 billion is what it will take to bring Toronto into the modern era with its transportation network. I don't think it's an unreasonable number.
Cherise, that number work for you?
It's definitely a start. We need to keep into consideration the cost of operations and maintenance, because the $2 billion number that I've heard is really about covering the capital costs.
So that only just starts to get the job done.
Indeed. And we also need to look at, we need the funding not only to be building some of that expensive infrastructure in place, but we also need to look at implementing solutions right now to get us out of gridlock right now.
Which presumably does not mean subways, because that's not a right now solution.
Well, I mean, that's a really good example, because the downtown relief line that people are talking about, the downtown relief subway, is a really important investment for next year's, or for the next generation, because it's going to take 10 to 15 even further years to build that. And we need solutions for this generation that's in a mobility crisis. We've got the Gardiner closed, Lakeshore's closing, we're stuck, we're jammed in subways, our streetcars aren't going anywhere. So we need to look again to these other cities to quick to deploy solutions to get us moving.
Well, you want to give me 3 other cities you've looked at you think are doing it right?
Okay, Vancouver, and for one, Calgary, Denver in the US, and close to home, York Region.
York Region, just north of Toronto?
Yes.
Boy, Torontonians are not going to like the notion that all of these other places are doing it better than them.
They're doing it faster, and they're actually implementing networks. And it's because they're not focusing on subways, they're focusing on other types of technologies that are quick to deploy, a portion of the cost, and can move people quickly.
Tess, you haven't covered the opening of a subway line, that's true.
That is
true. But you've seen some stuff go up. Would you say it's contributed to making the situation better?
I would. You know, I think sometimes example is the best way to lead. I often think, you know, Toronto's very bogged down in this LRT versus subway debate. And I think one of the problems with that debate is Torontonians, most of them have no experience of LRT as Europeans and other cities have experienced it. So when York Region, for example, puts in BRT, bus rapid transit, that's also something we don't have much of in Toronto and the region. It allows people to see what can be done relatively quickly, relatively cheaply, and how the world doesn't actually end because you've put a bus lane down the middle of the road.
Okay, but Jeff, let me try this. There'll probably be some people in Toronto who say it's all well and good to try BRTs in York Region. They've got these very vast, wide thoroughfares in which you could build them and not really be all that disruptive with the status quo. We don't have that in Toronto. We've got much smaller, narrower roads that are harder to disrupt if you want to put BRTs in. Is that a fair criticism?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think we have to look at what the domain is for each of those technologies. I mean, I agree with Charisse that we have to be, in some cases, technology agnostic. But there are certain domains where technologies make sense. I mean, I think, you know, replacing streetcars with buses certainly doesn't make sense. But if you wanted to do some long commute, some express routes, for example, from York Region to downtown or to further down on the subway, I think BRT would make sense. I think one simple to implement thing that would improve transportation in the city of Toronto is to give some hierarchy to the streetcar line. Every east-west line operates the same way in mixed traffic with horrendous congestion, and so they're completely subscribed, completely overwhelmed. But if you simply upgraded the right-of-way, took cars off of one of 2 east-west streets and increased the frequency, the reliability, the quality of the streetcar system would be astronomical. It would be a really quick turnaround.
Would there be hell to pay for any politician who recommended that?
You know what, Steve, I think it may be difficult, but if you were to take, for example, streetcars off the adjacent streets so that cars had a place to be displaced too, I think it would be a nice balance. And at some point we need leadership. And I think that's a really important point in all of this discussion. We have lots of talk about making movements in the right direction, but when it comes to election day, you see many parties and many candidates backing away from promises. And for me, that may be the most troubling part.
Okay, we have candidates coming on immediately after you. We'll put these suggestions to them. Tess, I want to bring you in on this new angle that I want to put on the table here. There are those who say it's impossible to do significant new construction of transit and/or transportation without what they call revenue tools, new dedicated streams of revenue that flow into the provincial coffers that they can spend on this. In your view, without raising taxes, can you do this?
Of course, but you're going to pay somewhere else. So I think that's actually a big part of the current election climate. It's whether or not somebody has the leadership, the guts, some would say suicidal instinct, to levy new taxes to pay for this. Apparently nobody does this time because nobody's talking about it as part of this campaign. However, my colleague Charisse has mentioned many times that it's just a matter of time that we have to have new money. And Charisse also makes the excellent point that we have to also look as well at building, as well as building new projects, new lines, we have to look at how we're going to operate them. We have the lowest subsidy levels in North America in terms of fares in Toronto. Go Riders are also paying a significant amount of their operating costs. I think we need to talk about both, and we are going to need new sources of income.
Charisse, is it possible to do all of the build that's on the books right now without new dedicated transportation revenue streams?
No, I don't think so. I think we can get started, and I think that we're seeing a lot of platforms dedicate money into a fund that goes to transit and dedicate that money for like 10 years of building, and that's great because that gets us started. But I do think we're going to have to introduce some revenue tools going forward, and I do think that we need to look at really challenging revenue tools like road pricing, and those are things like tolls, congestion charges, parking fees, and the only party that is currently talking about that is the Green Party. And that's because those types of tools serve two functions. They raise money, but they also help with that encouraging behavior change. So moving people from their cars onto transit. And I know that that's not very popular. That's probably the least popular kind of revenue tools. But even right-wing think tanks, including C.D. Howe Institute, the Manning Foundation, are warning that unless we start charging more for driving, we're not going to see the significant reduction in congestion that we need. Because simply if you build it, some will come, the same proportion of transit riders through population growth trajectory, but we need that actual shift. So if you look at this over time and you think of terms of fairness, if over time we've got 10 years of we're building some transit infrastructure, at some point we do have rapid transit available for drivers to actually take. So it might not be fair to be charging them if there aren't any options in place. But once there are options, then you can start looking at those tools as a way to not only raise more money going forward and paying off our debts, but also to help with that mode shift.
Jeff, have you heard or seen anything, save and except for the Green Party, which has already been acknowledged, has put something concrete forward on this, that attempts to create new dedicated revenue streams to pay for the transit we're talking about tonight?
My understanding is that the Liberal government had a whole suite of revenue tools that they were considering and were to be evaluated, and some were initially recommended, but as of recently, the party has moved away from those revenue tools, and this goes back and that goes back to my discussion of some leadership. I think it's really important. I just point out a contrasting city. If you think about a place like Singapore, which is becoming increasingly the place to do business in Asia, they are unbelievably progressive with their transportation pricing. If you drive into the downtown core during peak period, you pay a certain price. If you go at an off-peak time, you pay a different price. If you want to buy a car, you have to buy what's called a certificate of entitlement, and so you have to pay $20,000 for the right to buy a $20,000 car. And so revenue tools are in place. At the same time, if they need to build 300 more kilometers of rapid transit at $300 million a kilometer, so $90 billion invested in Singapore, the revenue streams exist. And there's congestion management, and the city is booming from an economic standpoint. So I think that Sharice's point is right. You have to provide alternatives first, but you have to have the revenue streams in order to put the alternatives in place.
When they put those revenue streams in place, did people hate it?
I think that there is the problem that we have, Steve, that's different in North America is we've got 6 decades of facilitating, fostering, encouraging single vehicle occupancy, driving our own personal car comfortably. And we've done that in the entire post-war period. And now we're fundamentally changing the way people think because we have to, because cities aren't functioning anymore the way that they're supposed to if we don't change our behavior.
Tess, as you've covered this, again, Jeff referred to these a suite of options out there that parties were considering. Do you see anything on offer for dedicated revenue streams from any of the parties, save and except for the Greens, in this election campaign?
No.
Plain
Nothing. Nobody's talking about it.
Well, so what happened?
Well, I think they are politically difficult causes to champion. I think Premier Kathleen Wynne went a long way toward putting the conversation on the table. A really long way. And I think if you were a group like the Toronto Region Board of Trade and you actually showed leadership on this issue and said, we're going to say yes to certain revenue tools, then you were probably a little bit disappointed. That said, if you believe the Liberal record on transportation has been superior to other proposals, then you might think reality is this is a start, and this is better than the alternatives.
Are you heartbroken that the Liberals are started here in terms of what they were prepared to do on revenue tools and now appear to be much less ambitious than that?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it heartbroken.
Oh, yeah, you would.
I'm disappointed with how I think the election and political gaming is hijacking good policy all around.
Meaning what?
Meaning that we're in a situation where we can't actually talk about those types of revenue tools, and we might have to wait until later. But one thing that I did want to point out, to give the Liberals some credit, is that in their budget they have introduced hot lanes, which is high occupancy toll lanes, which is sort of training wheels for toll highways, so to speak. And they're essentially they're lanes that are optional, that you can charge to take them and get into the fast lane, and carpoolers still get to ride for free in those. It doesn't generate a lot of revenue, so it's not necessarily.
What do you think? You get any idea how much it would realize?
Yeah, I can't remember. It's nominal.
Tens of millions of dollars?
Something in that order.
Right.
Yeah, but it more, I think what it really does is it helps to reduce congestion now by giving drivers options, and it helps to get people conditioned to the idea of having to pay for driving.
Okay. Jeff, go ahead.
Steve, I had a grad student who looked at exactly this issue, the HOT lanes. We did some surveys in Toronto, and something like 77% of drivers, when asked if they could have a lane that they could pay to access or to carpool in for free, would they support that if it guaranteed a level of service? And 77 or 78% said that they would support that. And that was right across income classes, ethnicities, race, it didn't matter. There was unanimous support that some people would be willing to pay for a guaranteed level of service on the freeway.
Okay, while you've got the floor, Jeff, let's take the accent off Toronto for a second, because it is the capital city and there's so much economic activity here, therefore it does sometimes get a disproportionate amount of attention. But of course there are public transit plans in places like Hamilton and Ottawa and Waterloo, where you are, and London. Mississauga, some of the, not multi-millions of people living there, but still good-sized cities.
Right.
How would you gauge the Liberal record on putting transit in those places?
So I have to, for the region of Waterloo, I have to give a very good grade to the Liberal Party. They and the federal government have come with 1/3 funding approximately for our rapid transit system. We are now about 550,000 on our way to 750,000. Some statistics say we're growing faster than that. But we're building light rail transit to avoid many of the same problems that Toronto is already experiencing. We're building LRT to bring people into the downtown core, to emphasize our downtowns, to avoid growing outward. And that's funded by, as I said, the 3 tiers of government: regional, the Liberals at the provincial level, and the federal government. And same thing is happening in Ottawa. Finally, there's some LRT that is being built there. The plans are underway in Hamilton, maybe not as far along as they are here in Waterloo. In London, there is some BRT that is being built. And so, at the smaller or mid-sized city scale, the Liberal government has been, I would say, very productive in supporting transit investments in these corridors.
Tess, how about you? You want to give them a grade on this?
I wouldn't give them a grade, but I would say they have been productive. If nothing else, we're here. We're having this conversation about transit. I'm not sure we heard it quite as loudly in the last election or the one before that. And I think they kickstarted something. I think whoever wins the election, there is an expectation they must do something. People are no longer prepared to put up with what we've got now.
Cherise, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to move forward with the lessons that we've learned, and we need to stop debating and start building. And we've got all kinds of information out there, and our decisions need to be based on evidence and no longer based on slogans and political gaming.
You're asking for that to happen in the middle of an election campaign. You are ambitious.
Well, certainly afterwards.
Afterwards,
as Tess had suggested.
Well, I'm going to pick up on your stop debating line, because we do have to stop debating. We've got 4 would-be politicians ready to go right after you. So I want to thank everybody for coming in today, helping us out with this. Jeff Cosello from the University of Waterloo, Cherise Berta from the Pembina Institute, Tess Kalinowski from the Toronto Star. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.